Another really useful and practical effect that you can add to your designs to really polish things up is called shadows. Now, of course, you can apply shadows to any object that you want. And the purpose of the shadow is to really separate your foreground, which is the main parts of your interface, such as the buttons, the text fields, and so on, from the rest of the page, from the background, and anything else behind those objects. Now, one thing you want to do, especially if you're a beginner designer, is to be more subtle with shadows. I notice a lot of designers tend to make their shadows a little bit too strong. So the purpose of the shadow is not to create a really strong effect on the object. In fact, we're trying to be as subtle as possible while making sure that shadow serves its purpose and also makes our design look more polished up. And you'll see how that looks in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and, as an example, apply a shadow to my button here. Now, of course, because our button is an instance here of that component, we can actually go to the component by just clicking here and clicking edit main component. So it just takes us up to that component where we have it. So this is our main component, and the beauty of components is that we can go ahead and add shadows to them, and it will be applied throughout our designs. So just as an example, I'm going to go ahead and add shadows to this button here by double clicking and selecting the background layer or this rectangle layer. And when it comes to shadows, we have two options. We can do an inner shadow, so this will be a shadow inside of the button. Now, this is typically used when you're trying to kind of create a 3D type of button, or you want to create maybe a touch state. So when a user touches the button, it will go ahead and show this inner shadow. Now, typically we see inner shadows more in game design rather than apps UI design. But of course, this is really up to you as a designer. But again, my tip to you is to go subtle with it. And so we'll go through what the shadows has to offer. So a shadow essentially has an X and Y position. So the X position is where that shadow falls in relation to that rectangle. So if we change this to, let's say, 20, our shadow will move 20 pixels to the right. And if we do, let's say, the same thing for the Y, you'll see our shadow completely moves 20 pixels to the right and 20 pixels down as an effect. And this right here, similar to the blur effects, is how blurred our shadow is. So if we change this to 20, our shadow becomes kind of more blended, I guess. And if we set this to 0, it will be very harsh and just a straight line kind of thing. So again, inner shadows, not so much what we're looking for, but we're looking for a drop shadow, which is more typically used in a UI design. So if we enable drop shadow, it will go ahead and create a shadow outside of that rectangle here, which is what we're looking for. And so XD will by default set this 0 X, 3 pixels for the Y, and 6 pixels for the blur itself. But you can play around with these numbers. So just to see what this itself would look like, you can go back to your designs. We can kind of see now what that shadow will look like. I think what I'd like to do is to create a bigger blur around that shadow and maybe bring it a few more pixels down. So just to apply those effects, we're going to go ahead and double click, select the rectangle, change this Y to maybe a 6, and change this blur to maybe a 15. Let's try that and see what happens. I think that looks a little bit better. I'm going to go back up here. And one thing I do want to note is that you can actually go ahead and change the color of the shadow by clicking this color selector icon over here. So of course you can apply a color to your shadows. We can do a red shadow, or we can do that green shadow. But typically you'd want to go with a black shadow, as that's more commonly used, and you want to go, again, very subtle with it. You don't want a strong shadow where the opacity is way too high. You want something where the opacity is maybe anywhere between 5 to I'm going to say maybe 20 to 30%, but this of course varies with what you have going on in the rest of your page. I like to use 10% here, or actually even a little bit lower, maybe 8%, because I want it to be very subtle. But as you can see, it still shows that effect. It's still you can still kind of see the effect of that shadow here. Now we can do the same thing with our text field here. So we can go and select the text field's background, do a drop shadow, and do the same 5 pixels, 15 pixels, and set the opacity to 8%. And now if I go here, you'll see my fields also have a shadow now too. But as you can kind of see, it's a little bit strong still for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here, select this and tweak this a little bit. So I'm going to actually lower the blur a little bit and change the opacity down to, let's do 4%. And I think that looks a little bit better, more subtle. You know, we don't want it to really kind of come out of the page too much. We want it to be subtle, and so I think that looks pretty good. Some other things we can apply shadows to in our design includes these cards here. So typically we see card designs or card UIs have some subtle shadow just kind of separated from the rest of the page. So what I'll do is I'll leave that as an exercise for you to do. Go ahead and add a shadow to our card over here and the card over here, and make sure, because this one's a component, to apply it to the main component. And again, keep it subtle. Do a drop shadow with an 8% opacity. And you can leave the X, Y as it is, 0 and 3, and then you can go ahead and apply a blur of 10 pixels. So I'll leave that to you, and then we'll do it together in the next lecture.